Hey everybody, this is Stephen with Answer Me This, and we come to our fourth question out of 5. I think in a previous video I might have said that there were only 4 videos, but there are 5, and this is the fourth one. And it has to do with it's a question about people who don't yet have the ability to believe in God. Young children, for example, babies, the severely disabled. Do they go to heaven automatically? What happens with them? And this is another difficult question, and it's one that, again, we don't have an exact answer to in the Bible, although we wish we did. Again, we have to kind of do our best to gather stories and texts and principles from the Bible in order to make our best guess. And I tend to like the answer of R.C. Sproule, who says, look, the Bible is silent on this issue, so I'm happy to let it be a mystery. And that's okay with me. And so there's some hope that potentially the children of non-believers go to heaven. But Sproule also says, and I agree with this as well, there's unfortunately not much assurance we can give to the families of non-believers when their child dies. Whereas the child of a believer, when a child of a believer dies, we have a rock-solid assurance that their child is with the Lord. And the reason we can give an assurance to a Christian parent, and we can't give it as we would like to a non-Christian parent, is because of a very important biblical doctrine called the Doctrine of Original Sin. And maybe you've heard of it before. It doesn't refer to the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, although that was the original sin, the first sin, so to speak. The doctrine of original sin has to do with our guilt corporately as in humanity, which we have inherited from Adam and Eve. They were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, out of the presence of God, and we were thrown out with them. And there's no way to get back. We can't get back into the presence of God. We can't get back into heaven because of this guilt. It must be dealt with. Every person's guilt must be dealt with by an atonement of blood. So there is no clear biblical assurance that God will let every child into heaven simply because, let's say God has a soft spot for babies in his heart. Could be, but we just don't know. And if that were true, if all infants do go to heaven, we almost could make a convincing argument for abortion. Why let children grow old enough to choose rebellion and go to hell? Abortion could be, on the one hand, the most grievous evil and injustice, and yet on the other hand, a great mercy. Of course, this is an extreme argument, and I don't know anyone who actually would say it, but you can see the logic of it. But how should we think about those who are not yet old enough to choose, to know right and wrong, and to choose God or reject him? Well, the only principle in the Bible that I can think of to move us towards an answer is God's covenant. God saves those who are in covenant with him. In the Old Testament, it was Israel. In the New Testament, it's the church. These are the ones whose guilt is paid. And so they're able to have access to the presence of God. In the Old Testament, it was through the imperfect sacrifices of the temple. And in the New Testament, it's through the perfect sacrifice of Christ. When the high priest makes atonement for sins, that atonement counts for everyone in that covenant community. And children are included. That was true for Israel, and we believe that it's true for the church in the New Testament as well. So this is where our confidence comes from for the children of believers. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7 that the child of at least one believing parent is holy, meaning that child belongs to God in a special way that other children do not. It's his child. God loves his children. And that's why we baptize our children in the Reformed Church, because we're putting that sign of belonging on them. Whereas the children of non-believers do not receive that sign. They don't get that benefit of covenant membership. They don't belong to the family of God, and therefore the blood spilled by the high priest is not accounted to them. So we're not sure how those children can get back into the garden, and by that we mean back into the presence of God, back into heaven, without their guilt, which they inherited from Adam, being dealt with or atoned for. But for Christians, we have a rock-solid assurance because their children have belonged to God ever since conception in the womb. They are holy. Now, of course, I realize this may raise an objection by some people. Another question, and say, wait a sec, are you saying that people can be saved without faith? That baptism somehow saves people? And no, I'm not saying that. This would be a good video for another time. But we know that both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, children were included in the covenant family. And yet, at some point, faith was required of that child. There is, so to speak, an age of accountability at which a child must either trust God, trust Jesus Christ, or walk away from the God of their fathers and break the covenant to which they belong. But we'll deal with that question in the next video as we look at the age of accountability. So that's my attempt at an answer. I hope it gives you something to think about. Thanks again for the question.